Good evening, folks. Welcome to Skeptics in the Pub Online. A especially warm welcome for any of you first-timers out there, and I think we've got a lot of you. My name's Brian. I'll be your host for the evening. For the first-timers, a little bit about us. In many towns and cities across the UK and all over the world, if you wander into the function room of a boozer on the right night, then you might be lucky enough to happen upon a Skeptics group holding a talk. Or at least you might have done before the COVID crisis hit us. But when that happened, we didn't just shut down operations. We banded together to form a coalition of the best skeptics groups in Edinburgh to bring you online talks of science and skepticism every Thursday evening at 7 p.m. British Summer Time. It is the best coming together of multiple bodies you can watch on the internet without having to use a private browser window. So we as skeptics essentially just want to believe things that are true and not believe things that are not true, using science, reason, and critical thinking. Not to turn us into intolerable smartasses, not to turn us into cold, unfeeling logic machines, but hopefully to make us better informed, more aware of our own shortcomings, maybe make some better life decisions and be more compassionate and understanding of others. We can but dream. So imagine our disappointment then when we find there are increasing numbers of people out there misrepresenting science in order to justify some pretty horrific attitudes. Seems to be getting worse ever since mid to late 2016. Who knows why? But that brings us on to the subject of tonight's talk, racism. With that in mind, just a word of warning, there is some content in tonight's talk that you may find upsetting, just due to the nature of the topic. Our speaker will warn you again as we come to those segments of the talk. A little bit of housekeeping. Our speaker is going to be talking for round about 45 minutes, after which we're going to take a break for you to go and grab a drink and whatever else you need to do. Then we'll reconvene shortly after 8 o'clock for questions and answers. You can post your questions into Slido. The link, I believe, is sli.do/Adam. Our moderators will be putting that into the text chat in Twitch right now. Even if you don't have questions, you can go into Slido and upvote your favourite questions, so they're more likely to be tackled during the Q&A. One thing we've learned is that democracy always works. You can also use the text chat area on Twitch for comments and witty banter. Please just keep it polite. Our moderator ninjas will be surveying proceedings with due attention. Also in the text chat, we'll be posting a PayPal link. If any of you want to throw a few quid in our direction to help us keep running these events, it'd be much appreciated. None of us make any money doing this, but we do have some cost to cover. Now, on to our speaker. Dr. Adam Rutherford's website lists him as an author, a broadcaster, a scientist, and a geek. There's no indication what order those come in. He studied genetics at University College London. During his PhD on the developing eye, he was part of the team that identified the first genetic cause of a form of childhood blindness. He's written and presented many award-winning series and programs for the BBC. He's the author of a number of books, including Creation, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, The Book of Humans, and now his latest release, the subject of tonight's talk, How to Argue with a Racist. All of his books, including his latest one, are available to buy in all good independent bookshops that could really do with your business in these difficult times. And then I think some of our moderator ninjas might be throwing some suggested links in there. If you're really struggling to find an independent bookstore to buy Adam's books, though, you could, I suppose, buy it from the rainforest-themed tax-dodging behemoth instead, if you have to. So please, everybody, go wild in the text chat. Give us your applause for Dr. Adam Rutherford. Adam, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Brian. That's a very kind introduction. And yeah, just to reiterate that, I love doing Skeptics in the pub, mostly because I love pubs. I don't mind Skeptics either. And it's a great tragedy that you have to do this like this, but I understand there are many more of you than can actually fit in a pub, so that's good. But if someone wouldn't mind bringing me a pint at about 7:30, that would be great. And an IPA request is absolutely fine. Now I've got my own housekeeping. So there's one is that, as Brian alluded to, then there is some. This is a serious issue, and there is some content in here which requires sensitivity. I will be warning about that. My second housekeeping issue is my dog Jessie, who is a little tiny puppy who should be asleep right now, but I just took him for a walk, and that seems to have not tired him out, but actually woken him up. So sorry about that. I'm sure Jesse will make an appearance at some point. Go to sleep, dog. I guess the third thing is that it's more about the content as well, which is that I'm going to be talking about race and racism primarily from a European perspective. And there's two reasons for that. One, that is I'm European, and this is the culture with which I'm familiar and which the majority of the book is about. The second reason, I guess, is that the predominant forms of racism that I'll be talking about, indeed the predominant forms of racism that exist today, are largely, I argue in the book, and I'll be talking about tonight, derived from European expansionism, colonialism, empire building, and those types of issues, all of which are centered around this thing we call the Enlightenment, which is largely a European phenomenon, the Enlightenment of Europe to the rest of the world, and I say that in quotation marks. Jesse, I need you to chill out and go to sleep now, mister. Okay. I can't see you. I've got no idea whether anyone's watching this or not, or just listening to me talking to my dog. Anyway, so the book is How to Argue with a Racist. This first slide shows the cover. I suppose I should briefly talk about why I wrote it. So I've been writing it over the last couple of years, but it's built on, it's a vastly expanded from a chapter in a previous book, but one ago, A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, which is about genetics and human evolution and culture. Anticipating or recognizing, as Brian alluded to again, that the discussions about race have become more part of the public discourse in recent years. And for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute, science has been or is in danger of being co-opted into those sorts of discussions, where the concept of race is really non-controversial within genetics, my field, in that we talk about it not being a biological reality, but a social construct. And I'll explore that in a bit as well. Now, this is non-controversial to say that within the walls of the academy, but over the last few years, as a science communicator, particularly focused on genetics and evolution, I began to notice that the public discourse concerning race and biology was somewhat different from the conversations I was having within the walls of the lab. And in some ways that is on me. That is a failure to communicate contemporary thinking within human genetics. And so this is an attempt to redress that balance and primarily to equip people to deal with questions about race and justifying bigotry using science, specifically with focusing on the history of scientific racism and contemporary understanding of genetics. So if I just go to the first slide. So I've talked about a couple of those issues just then. We've had a changing political atmosphere, the rise of nationalism, further discourse on race being part of our public discourse in a far greater way than in living memory. That is not to say that racism went away. It's simply that it is more exposed than pretty much at any time that I can remember in my adult life. In parallel to that, we've had a huge growth and maturation of human genetics, which is great, and a matching popular interest in genetics, which is also great, particularly for people like me. But part of that is something that we in the genetics community didn't really predict would happen, which was the sort of unprecedented interest in genetics that was driven by the enormity of the commercial genetics market, which is primarily driven by ancestry testing kits from companies such as 23andMe and Ancestry.com and many others. Now, those companies, those two companies specifically, now own more human genomes and more human genome data than any science lab on Earth in total. And that's an interesting phenomenon I don't think we picked up on. But one of the things that commercial ancestry testing does as well, I argue, is that it reinforces some older notions about biological essentialism and genetic destiny, which I think are things that we had been moving away from in trying to communicate genetics and trying to understand human variation, but were somehow reinforced by what these tests actually do. I'm going to take that off you, mister. Can I take that? Drop, good boy, not good boy. Right, okay. So there's 4 chapters in the book. It is a deliberately short book because I wanted it to be punchy and easily digestible and really equip people with many of the tools, the scientific tools and the historical knowledge that enables them to deal with questions of race. So there's the origin of race, there's concepts of racial purity, race and sport, which I think is enormously important, even if you're not into sport. I am into sport, and I recognize that a lot of people aren't interested in sport, but I think that historically and today, sports is one of the domains, the public domains, which is very popular, in which we are exposed to different groups of people from around the world, and some stereotypes of race emerge from that. I might touch upon some of those in a little bit. And then the 4 chapters on race and intelligence, which requires a whole series of lectures on its own. I probably won't talk about that tonight, but if it comes up in the questions, then maybe we can talk about it there. So just, this is my own 23andMe data map. I'm half Indian, so my mother was born in Guyana, but descended from the indentured from India, which is a form of slavery. My dad is from Yorkshire. He was born in Scarborough, or Robinhood's Bay, in fact. And what you can see in this is because of that mix, I've got an almost 50-50, perfect 50-50 match of where my DNA most resembles today. Now, this is a really important point because there isn't a scientific method of identifying where your ancestors come from using genetics. What these maps do, what this data does, is it compares your DNA to the DNA of other paying customers. Until very recently, that's fine. Until very recently, the Indian half of my genome was just one block because the people who tend to buy these tests come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, and therefore the resolution for my European genome, so half of my DNA was very high, and you could pick out individual points from Scandinavia and basically Northwest Europe. But until very recently, when the Indian half of it had been repopulated, it was just this block of text was basically all Indians are absolutely identical. But let me just stress that thing again. It doesn't say where your ancestors are from. It says where people on Earth today have DNA similar to you today. And from that, we infer where your ancestors are actually from. Now, part of my problem I have many problems with these types of commercial tests, but part of it is they have the effect of reinforcing or suggesting this kind of essentialism, this kind of cultural affinity that is based on where your DNA most resembles. So I get a lot of traffic from people telling me, well, white people all want to discover that they're descended from Vikings. Well, you are, and I will explain that in just a minute. But does that say anything about you or your personality or your behavior? No, it does not. The fact that my Indian DNA is most similar to more than 1 billion people in India and Pakistan and Afghanistan says nothing about me as a person, because I was born in Ipswich and my parents split up when I was very little. I was raised by my stepmother from a very early age, and so my cultural affinity is nothing to do with India or indeed Guyana, which is where my mother was actually born, but it is being from Ipswich. I support Ipswich Town, and I come from Suffolk and I'll be going to Aldborough next week. But that's not what these tests sort of imply, or that's not what the attraction of these types of tests are. It is the appeal of discovering something about yourself that you did not know, and that this is encoded in DNA. Now, this is what a standard family tree looks like. So there's you at the bottom there, and then you have 2 parents and 4 grandparents and 8 great-grandparents and so on. So if you go back 7 generations, you have 256 people on there if you are fully outbred. And I've just made the point that I was born in Suffolk, so that possibly, well, we'll park that just for a minute. But it relies on the notion, which is absolutely true, that everyone in history has had 2 parents. There are some caveats to that. Jesus is one of them. I'm just playing to the skeptics audience. Doesn't go down so well in religious talks, that joke. So that's a standard family tree, but of course no family tree actually looks like that, because people are complex and families are complicated and mixed up through the generations. And in fact, that's a genealogical family tree. What we now think is that family trees look much more like this. right? So this is what family trees really look like. There's you at the bottom there. And what I mean by this is that you have this, if you double the number of ancestors you have as you go back in time, it means that you have 2 to the power of n ancestors, where n is the number of generations you go back. By the time you get 1,000 years back into the past, say, which is roughly 40 generations, then you'll have more than 1 trillion ancestors, and there haven't been 1 trillion humans alive on Earth in the history of this planet. And so what we actually see is what's shown on this chart here by Graham Coop, who's a geneticist in the States, UC Santa Barbara, which is that you have that number of positions on your family tree, 2 to the power of n, but rapidly they become filled with the same people multiple times over until eventually all branches of all family trees cross through all individuals at a point, at a time that we refer to as the genetic isopoint. But what the point of this is that we're incredibly inbred, not just not just Suffolk boys like myself, but humanity is. We are all descended from the same populations in the very recent past. So all Europeans are descended from the same population only 1,000 years ago, and all humans are descended from the same population only 3,500 years ago. So that's about the 14th century BCE, which is the time of Ramesses II or Confucius, or pick someone from history at that time. So if you were alive at the isopoint, say 1,000 years ago in Europe, or 3,500 years ago in the rest of the world, if you're alive at that time and you have living descendants alive today, then you are the ancestor of everyone alive today. All family tree lines for all people will pass through all individuals over, for Europe 1,000 years ago, for the whole world 3,500 years ago. So the concept of ancestral purity is just nonsense, right? It doesn't exist. And when we do those genealogy tests, or when we look at our family trees using traditional genealogy, or when we watch programs like Who Do You Think You Are, what they all do is reinforce this notion that we have these pure lineages that we can trace back, and they say something about us. That if you can trace your ancestry back to, the Vikings, or William the Conqueror, or Edward III, or anyone you want to name in history, that somehow that gives you a lineage and says something about the purity of your lineage, when in fact by doing that you're ignoring everyone else on your family tree. I found out during the writing of this book that my 5 times great grandmother was a Native American circus performing horse jumper called Mary Huntley, whose wedding certificate we have. She was married in Covent Garden in 1821, and it says Savage on that marriage certificate. Now, that's pretty cool that I'm descended from a circus, a Native American horse jumping circus performer. Of course, it means absolutely nothing, not me. I probably don't carry any of her genetics and any of her DNA. And indeed, I'm ignoring all of the other people on exactly the same tier of that family tree, which is 63 other women and 64 other men. So this family tree here is a much better representation of how messed up, how our trees are not trees, but they're webs, they're matted webs. Now, the reason I'm talking about this as well is because white supremacists are absolutely obsessed with the concept of racial purity, specifically white purity, because that allows them, or in their worldview, it allows them to demonstrate their own both purity and superiority over the other races of the world. Now, the oldest and longest standing white supremacist website is Stormfront, which was founded in '93, so it's been around for a long time. It is, I believe, the most popular to date. And I spend a lot of time hanging around racist forums on the internet, mostly so that you don't have to. But there are a lot of discussions about racial purity and ancestry testing on these types of forums. Here's a screenshot from 4chan. And I'm sorry, Jesse's being very distracting in the background here. Dude, come on, show your boots, man. On the sofa. Come on. One of the things that is slightly amusing in looking at these very dark places on the internet is that when they take these types of tests like 23andMe and Ancestry.com and reveal that what they reveal is that they've got recent ancestry from people who they despise, from non-Northern white Europeans. I've been tracking this for years now. But a couple of years ago, there was the first actual study of this as a phenomenon, which was just based on Stormfront, and it was something like 3,000 comments from Stormfront, where people had specifically taken a test and had discovered that they had non-white European, Northwestern European specifically, ancestry, and then tracked the comments, tracked the revelations, how they express themselves. The one on the screen at the moment is, well, it's something of a joke, I suppose. My life has been a lie. Where do I go from here? Says this person. But the comments broadly fall into several neat silos here. The first of which is try another company for a different result. Now that's Jesse interrupted that with a sort of joke, I suppose, because that does sound kind of funny. That's not actually as ridiculous as it sounds, because the different companies do have different panels that they refer to, and you can get slightly different results from different companies, which somewhat reinforces the notion that these are not that much more than sort of shiny gimcrack. Now, Jesse, call your jets, pal. The second most common one is that 23andMe is run by Jews. Try another company for a different result. Okay, we're into conspiracy territory now, with 23andMe is run by Jews who plant false information to sow racial disharmony. Try another company for a different result. This one I thought was particularly telling. This is a specific example. Look in the mirror. If you don't see a Jew, you're okay. Now, this seems, apart from the fact that it's deeply, deeply anti-Semitic, it also seems sort of scientifically problematic on the grounds that if you're using a test to demonstrate your racial purity or your non-Jewish ancestry, and it shows that you have Jewish ancestry, and then you can just ignore that by deciding that you're not Jewish, then you've really wasted £100 or $100 in taking the test in the first place. And then other examples are simply that you should kill yourself. Now, I don't want to talk too much about white supremacists, because I think they're far less interesting than people who don't believe they're racist, but actually express racist views. These are overt racists, of course, and they're not people with whom you can reason. They didn't reason themselves into having those bigoted views. But that obsession with racial purity that has been somewhat enhanced or bolstered by modern genetics, or these modern commercial genetic testing kits, is exemplified by a phenomenon that emerged a couple of years ago. So the person on the left you might recognize as Richard Spencer, so the coiner of the alt-right, a white supremacist by any definition. And you'll note that between his first and second name on this was his Twitter handle, is a glass of milk, and on the right-hand side there is a video which is from YouTube, reported in the New York Times, of white supremacists chugging milk. It's referred to as chugging milk, where they take milk and they down it by the liter. Now, the idea behind this is one of the most, a complete misunderstanding of one of the most interesting pieces of recent recent understanding of genetics and human evolution, which is to do with a concept called lactase persistence. So white people, Europeans predominantly, can process milk after weaning. So they have a particular enzyme which continues to work after children have stopped breastfeeding, which allows them to continue to process milk into adulthood, and that is why we have milk on our cereal in the morning. We know when that occurred. We know that the fixation, the frequency with which that genetic allele exists in Europeans is extremely high, and it's very low for the rest of the world. Now, these guys have got hold of this and think that somehow that demonstrates their A, racial purity, and B, for some reason, racial superiority. They have failed to notice in the identification of this gene that it also exists in the Hutu, in members of the Khoikhoi, the Khoisan, in Middle Eastern camel herders. Basically, anyone whose ancestors were pastoralists, were dairy farmers, have developed exactly this genetic capability, lactase persistence, and the ability to process milk. And so it's very easy to mock these people because they are ridiculous, but they make it easier for us by being so pig ignorant and abusing, misunderstanding science in order to bolster their racism. It's got a plant pot. Okay, now I want to park the white supremacist aside because, as I said, they're far less interesting than the conversation we're having in the public discourse at the moment, which, as I said at the beginning, it seems to be more prevalent than at any other time in history. And it's part of our national discourse. We have a prime minister who is a racist. I feel no compunction about saying that. It is, of course, impossible to know the heart of a man or a woman, but he has frequently written specifically racist things in the past. I'm sure you all know about that. In the interest of political balance, and these are not my views, but the fact that anti-Semitism has become one of the defining issues of the Labour Party and the Labour movement in the last few years is oh my God, is factually correct. Whether or not it is true or whether you believe it or not is a different matter, but the fact that the Jewish Chronicle put that on the cover of their newspaper in 2018 is significant. And then earlier this year, Dominic Cumming, the PM's chief advisor, recruited a young man called Andrew Sobieski, both of whom have expressed frequent interest in racialized eugenics and a misunderstanding of contemporary human genetics. Both of them form. I'm gonna, excuse me, Jesse. No, just leave that. Enough. Come on, shush. Sofa. Thank you. Just call your Jets, boy. Yeah, what was I saying? Anyway, racism is part of the national discourse. Now, one thing I want to stress is that I do think that it is right to say that we are a less racist country than we have been at any point in the past. It is perhaps more accurate to say that there is the current exposure of racism which has never gone away, a structural racism, which isn't simply what the white supremacists do, which is to basically call each other names. It's quite difficult to assess scientifically or via surveys how racist the country is. The British Attitudes Survey has been running since 1983, and back then, when asked the question, so when you ask questions, are you a racist, people tend to either lie or not answer, understandably. So we ask questions by proxy, and you say things like, well, how happy would you be if your son or daughter married someone of a different race? 1983, when that question was first asked in the British Attitudes Survey, the answer came out about 40% of people would be deeply unhappy if their son or daughter married a black person or an Asian person. And that number has now dropped to below 16% when it was asked 2 years ago. However, that was also the first year that the question was asked of Muslims. So would you be happy if your son or daughter married a Muslim? And the number there was, I think, 40% again. So racism and bigotry, it doesn't go away, but it shifts according to current and changing cultures. And I recognize that Islamophobia people refer to it as not being, you can't be racist because it's a religion. There are other forms of racism which aren't predicated primarily on skin color. Now, I do think that things are better today than they have been in the past. This was a Conservative Party leaflet for Smethwick near Birmingham from '64. If you desire a colour for a neighbour, vote Labour. If you're already burdened with one, vote Tory. Jesse, who is being extremely unhelpful at this very point in time, is named after this man in the middle, Jesse Owens, one of the finest athletes of all time. And I think this is one of the most powerful photos that I'm aware of, where he cleaned up 4 gold medals in the Olympics in '36. Not just an amazing feat in itself, but he did it literally in front of Adolf Hitler. And so this was massively undermined by his own coach, subsequently, a guy called Dean Cromwell, referring to him and black people in general as being closer to nature. It wasn't that long ago that they had to run away from gazelles or tigers in the veldt. So sport is a domain in which racism has been expressed and racialized views have been expressed for forever. In football in the UK, this is a picture of the great John Barnes in '88 kicking a banana off the pitch that had been thrown at him, as happened week on week for all black players in English football during that era. Now, football has made great strides in eradicating or trying to eradicate racism from football and continues to do so with a good deal of success. However, there is Aubameyang in 2018 in exactly the same position with the banana skin being thrown onto the pitch there at the Emirates. I guess the difference is that thousands of people were doing it back in 1988. In 2018, when this happened, on other occasions in recent history, when this happened, the perpetrators were banned for life, and they were immediately identified as being racists. So I guess things are better, but they certainly haven't gone away. And often people say, "Yeah, come on, Britain is really it's not really a very racist country. You guys, the number of people that tell me on Twitter that I seem obsessed with race, why don't I just chill out?" I don't find this a very compelling argument. We don't just stop because things are better. So I mentioned at the beginning, and something which is uncontroversial in science, which is that race as we currently recognize it and talk about it is a social construct and not a biological reality. Now, sometimes that gets translated or sort of simplified into the phrase that race does not exist. Now, I think this is really important, a really important point. Race absolutely does exist. It exists because it is a social construct and not as a biological construct. Race exists because we deem that it does. We recognize differences in populations and we attach social categories to them in a way that people recognize. I don't think it's helpful to say that race does not exist, because you're actually denying people's experience. You're asking people to say that this social agreement that we have the world over, which is very flexible through time, as I'm going to talk about, is not permanent and is not essentialist. You're asking people to deny the thing that they're looking at. So that's the thing that I'm going to focus on in the next, how long have we been talking? It's probably been half an hour already. In the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll break for questions. Okay, so there's the 4 chapters, and I'm just going to talk about the origin of race, because the origin of race relates specifically to the current concepts of how we recognize race, how we talk about race as a social construct. But also, it's very important because it is the root of not just my science, which is evolutionary genetics or biology in general, but it is in fact inherently tied to the root of all science via this project that we fondly refer to as the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason or the Scientific Revolution. All terms that I have some problems with as post hoc labels, that are a little bit like statues, don't necessarily actually accurately display or discuss history, but simply put a marker in the sand and say this is a thing that happened. So I'm going to talk primarily about skin color. There's a nice slide of some variation in skin color on some young children. And the reason I want to talk about skin color is because from the origin of race as we think about it today, which begins in the 17th century or so, skin color was the primary determinant of how we would describe, how we would taxonomize or classify the people of the earth as we would meet them, as Europeans would meet them via colonial expansion. And that is not to say that when I say the invention of race occurs in the 17th century or so, that is not to say that the recognition of differences between populations and the recognition of different pigmentations in people is not much older. It obviously is. It's also not to say that everything was hunky-dory and sweet and rosy back before the 17th century. Things were, I believe, much worse in ancient history for most people than they are today. It's simply the case that the racial epithets we use today and the social structure of racism that we experience today and that we enact today was not present until European expansionism. And this, by the way, is not a controversial idea within history. This is pretty standard history of race stuff. It's just that I think that it was new to me learning this, because I'm a scientist, not a historian. So it was new to me over the last decade or so. but also I don't think it's necessarily well known within scientific communities. And it's something that we don't necessarily recognize, that the roots of our subjects are based on racial pseudoscience. But just to go back to the earliest references to pigmentation, actually with our earliest texts altogether, which is the Iliad and the Odyssey, possibly by this chap, in which pigmentation is described for different characters, notably Odysseus, whose skin pigmentation actually changes during the Odyssey and the Iliad. And he's described as swarthy and dark-skinned, but more as a descriptor of his character than anything else. Sort of equivalent to, and this was what happened a lot in classical descriptions of pigmentation. They are more references to their characters than they are to any sort of particular group of people. The offensive comparison in contemporary language is sort of like referring to women as blonde as an insult. The implication being that they might be a bit ditzy, which I recognize that is absolutely an offensive thing to say, but that's a sort of equivalent to the classical references to color. The earliest reference to sub-Saharan African pigmentations comes from the word Aethiops, as in Ethiopia. Aethiops literally means burnt face or burnt skin. Now, one of the reasons that people tend to think about pigmentation and the ancient world as being predominantly white, this is something that Mary Beard talks about very eloquently, and David Olusoga as well, it's a lot to do with the fact that the remaining classical statues that we have today are white. They weren't white back in the day. They were mostly brightly colored, painted, but the paint has washed off over the millennia. We have images from round about the time of the Isopoint that I was talking about earlier, of multiple skin tones from sub-Saharan Africans, and this is from the tomb of an Egyptian governor around about the time of Tutankhamun. But again, all of these references tend not to be as a primary classifier. So the descriptions of the different types of people of the world, partially to simply identify them, partially to justify bigotry or warfare or subjugation or slavery, it wasn't primarily determined by pigmentation. They were much more concerned with language, geography, culture, religion, and not pigmentation. The first indication that we have as pigmentation being a determinant of character, and therefore potentially useful for the subjugation, for the enslavement of people, comes from Avicenna, the great Uzbeki sort of proto-scientist, philosopher, and thinker. And he writes about the Islamic slave trade, which lasts for more than 900 years and possibly 5 million people enslaved during that era, but describes people with very dark skin, which we think are sub-Saharan Africans, as being feckless, but strong, and therefore ripe for subjugation. But interesting, he also refers to very pale-skinned Northern Europeans as being stupid and fickle, and therefore also should be enslaved. So this is the first example, really, that we have of using skin color to try and determine the character of a people with the intention of subjugating them, the intention of othering them such that enslavement of them becomes more reasonable. And that becomes the primary principle between of the classification of people that occurs with European expansionism that begins in the 17th century, 17th, 18th century. I want to talk about these 5 men. They're all great founders of Western philosophy because but they are also part of the beginning of the discussions about race and the descriptions of people in these heavily racialized terms, in order that they could be not only classified but also hierarchically classified, and therefore again justifying the subjugation of people. Now, who have we got here? We've got Voltaire's in the middle, and that's Kant on the right, and that's Linnaeus top left, and Blumenbach, and then Galton is sorry, not Galton, that's Huxley, comes a little bit later. But I'm going to briefly talk about all of them. As these people are many of them who didn't travel at all, but as they are beginning to experience people from the rest of the world and trying to apply scientific, what we now think are pseudoscientific classifiers to the people that they meet. There were two sort of schools of thought, two broad philosophies in opposition to each other, which were referred to as the monogenists and the polygenists. And the monogenists, well, you've got to remember that everyone is a biblical creationist at this time. There is no one, well, apart from Voltaire, but most people adhere to the belief that the account of the origin of humankind in Genesis is correct. We are all derived from Adam and Eve. And the Garden of Eden being somewhere in the Middle East. The monogenists thought that that was literally the case, that we acquired the different characteristics that you see in people around the world as we migrated away from the Garden of Eden, and acquired those characteristics as a result of well, just sort of local adaptation in a way, which is a remarkably modern sort of evolutionary thought. The polygenists thought that people migrated away from Adam and Eve, and once they reached those locations, developed those characteristics in situ. I mean, it's an interesting parallel with much of the arguments about human origins that occurred in the late 20th century in the multi-regional hypothesis, where people had argued, not wholly unsuccessfully for a few years, that the differences we see between people is that they emerge from different lineages of humans around the world. But that was put to bed by what we now think is, unequivocally think is correct, which is the out of Africa hypothesis, which is that we are an African species, and that around 70 to 100,000 years ago, a population migrated away from Africa, and we changed on that trajectory as we moved around the world. Now, I want to focus a little bit on Carl Linnaeus, and you'll all be familiar with him. We still use his system of classification in all areas of biology. That's genus and species in Latin, Homo sapiens, or Pan Brodites if you're a chimpanzee, or Pampaniscus if you're a bonobo, gorilla if you're a gorilla, gorilla if you're a Western gorilla. I just find that quite amusing. The Eastern gorilla is called Gorilla Beringii, after a guy called Beringe, a Belgian man who was the first person to shoot one. Anyway, that's an irrelevant aside. Linnaeus wrote more than 13 volumes of Systema Naturae during his life, in which he tried to classify all living things. He also tried to classify rocks in there as well, but that didn't really work out. And it's an important piece of work. It's also an incredibly racist piece of work, because in the categorization of humans, of Homo sapiens, he introduces subspecies which are based on racialized characteristics. 5 he introduces. Americanus, so that would be Native Americans or indigenous people of America, whose skin is red, black straight hair, stubborn, zealous, and regulated by customs. Asiaticus, or East Asians, we might refer to those populations today. Yellow skin, stiff black hair, dark eyes, haughty, greedy, ruled by opinions. Africanus, black skin, frizzled hair, silky skin, flat nose. You can read it for yourself. Now, what's worth pointing out here is, well, 2 things. The first is that skin color is the primary determinant, right? It's the first thing mentioned, the skin color of these people. The second thing is that you can see how quickly it goes from a phenotypic description, inaccurate as they might be, or very broad brush accuracy as they might be, into value judgments: stubborn, haughty, greedy, females without shame. Now, there was also Homo sapiens europaeus, who were white-skinned with blue eyes, gentle, acute, inventive, and governed by laws. And so this is the first taxonomy that is really significantly hierarchical. And of course, in all of these taxonomies by many different people of this time, white Europeans come top of the pile. So it's not merely taxonomy or classification, it is hierarchical. It is a ranking system. It is Europeans and everyone else. Now, I'm just going to include in a later edition, he also introduced Homo sapiens monstrosus, which included Patagonian giants and alpine dwarves and mono-orchid Hottentots, which is, well, men with one testicle from what we now call Bushmen or Khoisan. I include that partially because it's amusing and ridiculous, but it also shows how absurd this categorization system was. And although we still rely on Linnaeus's taxonomy for describing biological organisms today, you can see how borderline nonsensical his descriptions of humans are at this time. And yet they are the founding principles of human classification. This is the first really significant scientific description of humans, and it is one that has echoes into the present day. Now, on the other side of so Linnaeus is a monogenist. The most prominent polygenist was Voltaire, one of the great heroes in the Enlightenment, and I'm sure many of you will be fans of his work. Now, he was a great thinker and very amusing as a writer. He was also profoundly racist as well. And I think the reason I want to talk about these guys is because one of the key principles in science is that we talk about how we stand on the shoulders of giants. We see further by standing on the shoulders of giants. We pay reference to people who have come before us and done the foundational work on which we base our current work. That was a phrase that was made popular by Newton in a letter to Hooke in 16 something. Someone in the comments will tell me the exact date. But in fact, he was referencing Bernard of Chartres, who's an 11th century philosopher from France, who himself was referencing the legend of Orion the Hunter, who temporarily blinded, placed his dwarf slave or servant on his shoulder so he can continue to hunt. And it's a beautiful and important phrase that we should revere and should continue to use. But it only tells half of the picture, because we also have to recognize that we stand on the shoulders of these giants, of these intellectual giants, who were also terrible people, or held terrible views, or held views that we now find appalling. I know that we are not meant to judge people by contemporary standards in history, but it is possible to contextualize their views relative to the time. This is one of the things that Voltaire had said about sub-Saharan African people, and this is deeply offensive and deeply problematic. You can read that for yourself. Voltaire believed that sub-Saharan African people were a different species from Homo sapiens. Such was the depth of his racism. And yet, again, we regard him as one of the great founders of European thought, which is fine. But we need to recognize and understand our own history. Perhaps people will talk about cancel culture or revisiting these heroes, intellectual heroes or otherwise from our past. And maybe that will come up in the discussions, because I think, well, I have complex views on that matter. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was a German scientist from around about the same time, and he's the first person to start using actual metrics, so actually starting to measure things in order to classify humans. And he comes up with a taxonomy based on measuring 60 skulls that are being given to him from around the world from explorers and travelers. And with that, he came up with a system which was pretty much the same as Linnaeus's, so 5 primary races. Now, I again, referring to people, everyone being more racist back in history, which is, I think, reasonable to say, but also contextualizing that not everyone was as racist as each other, and certainly not everyone was as racist as Voltaire. We're very lucky in biology that we have Darwin as our figurehead, who was measurably more liberal and less racist than many of his contemporaries. We think this may be to do with the fact that he was very close to his taxidermy tutor whilst an undergraduate at Edinburgh, who was a freedman called John Edmonston. And this is a post hoc, a posthumous image of him. There are no recorded images of John Edmonston. Now, Darwin talks about race in his second best book, The Descent of Man, of which I have a copy up there. And now, Darwin is not without problem when it comes to discussing the people of the earth. He is significantly less racist than most Victorian scientists, including his cousin Francis Galton, who was a profoundly racist man, and I've talked about him to skeptics groups over the last few years. But he, in The Descent of Man, he actually makes a slight mockery of the whole concept of race by pointing out how many different people have tried to categorize the races, and how no one can agree on a number, the range being between 1 and 63. He also goes on to say this, that that he thinks that they are not discrete groups of people at all, but that they graduate into each other. And he goes on to say that he can't imagine that any characteristics described within the so-called races would have immutability, would be permanent, or couldn't change over a few generations. So again, very prescient, and based largely on data and his extensive travels and meeting people of the earth. Darwin, not without problems, but far less racist than most people of that time. Now, Thomas Huxley was Darwin's greatest defender, and he had a go at racial classification in the 1870s, and this is a version of his map. And you'll notice that there are many more categories. So there's many more designations of races of the people of the earth compared to, say, Linnaeus or Blumenbach. And he, for example, makes distinctions between the people in Europe, the people in Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southern Africa. So they're referred to as Melanochroi, Xanthochroi being Europeans, Negro and Bushmen. And I mean, that's interesting. He's very reverent to the Linnaeuses and the Blumenbachs of the past, but recognizes that there are quite clearly many more different types of people than that can be categorized into those 5 clumsy groups. Now, I bring him up for a specific reason, and this comes with a warning, because this is not pleasant what is to follow. But it refers specifically to the fact that Huxley and others, I'm not laying this at Huxley's door, but Huxley and others, their distinction between the Melanochroi and the Negro within Africa was in some ways predicated on an invention of anthropology of that time. They recognized that the Melanochroi had lighter skin than Sub-Saharan Africans, described as Negroes, and an invented category of people called the Hamites, descended from Ham, the son of Noah, was used to account for the influx of this lighter, these European skin tones into some parts of Africa, but not into others. And this is important for a number of reasons. It's not correct. There are many complications about the skin tones within Africa, which I will refer to in just a minute. But it's important for a specific reason, because this misunderstanding or this invention of science becomes the basis for what is inarguably one of the greatest atrocities of the 20th century, which is the Rwandan Civil War. And so, without going into too much detail about the history of Rwanda, that during colonialization, it was initially the Germans who had control as colonizers of what we now refer to as Rwanda. And there are 2 primary tribes within Rwanda, the Hutu and the Tutsi, and they are, until German and subsequently Belgian rule, were had largely affable relations, have distinct lineages, the Hutu being pastoralists with slightly paler skin, and this was capitalized upon by Germans who wanted to maintain better relationship with the Hutu, and therefore asserted that they had input from, they had paler skin as a result of introgression from the Hamites, this made-up group of people. Now, so this is the racialization of a group, and this is primarily for commercial reasons. They had better commercial relationships with the Hutu and Tutsi. The Belgians take over and they reinforce this in the beginning of the 20th century, and by the 1930s, this has been introduced into identification cards. So if you look at just underneath the photo there, you can see Hutu, Tutsi, and 2 other smaller tribal groups of people. So this is a sort of formal racialization of tribal groups that are not fundamentally distinct from each other in any great significant way. But this escalates, and I suppose the biggest tragedy of this is that the Hutu and the Tutsi buy into this mythology that is based on pseudoscience and a fiction. And it escalates after the colonizers leave in 59 and install a government. There's civil war throughout the next several decades, which culminates in the 1990s with the civil war that occurred, in which hundreds of thousands were murdered in the space of just 100 days. Is the first time the United Nations refers to rape as a weapon of war. All of that predicated on the pseudoscience of colonizers in the late 18th and early 19th century. And remember that this is 1994, right? So I'm an undergraduate at UCL in the Galton Laboratory studying genetics while this is taking place. So this is not ancient history at all. Most or many of you watching right now will remember this very clearly, but the roots of it are very, very clearly associated with the pseudoscience of race that was introduced by our founding intellectual fathers such as Linnaeus and Voltaire and Blumenbach and the like. How am I doing for time? Jesse's all quiet now. Okay, yeah, let me wrap up so we can go to questions so we can have a drink in just a minute. So I referred earlier to Homo sapiens being an African species. The out of Africa hypothesis is the one that we think is most true, although there are now some very interesting details on that which we haven't, which are beginning to emerge in the era of genomics. But what that basically means is that Homo sapiens is an African species, which means that most of our evolution occurred within Africa until relatively recently. That was in the Rift Valley in East Africa, where most remains were found. But the oldest Homo sapiens are now identified from Morocco in a place called Jebel Arud, and that's about 300,000 years ago. So a new model is beginning to emerge that we are a sort of pan-African species, but it still is that the out of Africa hypothesis is correct. And at some point in the last 100,000 years, a relatively small population, a sort of sampling error of a population, emerged out of Africa, migrated around the world, and it is primarily from that pool of people that the peopling of the rest of the world occurred. That is shown. The map that I'm showing at the moment is from Chris Stringer, who I know has given Skeptics talks in the past, and this is based largely on paleoanthropological data, so old bones. We can sort of recapitulate that map using genetic data now, and so this is from my colleagues at the genetics department at UCL, Mark Thomas primarily, and this is one of those scaled maps, which in this particular case shows the size of the continents or size of the land masses based on the amount of genetic diversity within those areas. And so what you can clearly see from that is that there is more genetic diversity within Africa than in the rest of the world put together. And that rings true with our theory of the out of Africa hypothesis, which is that most human evolution occurred within Africa. Now, I started this section by talking about pigmentation and talking about how pigmentation had been the primary determinant for the racial categorizations of those men in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it is still, as we are a very visual species, the primary determinant for the racializations of social categories that we use today. But it's meaningless scientifically, or virtually meaningless scientifically, for reasons that really have only come to light in doing proper studies on the African continent with African people, which have only really occurred with any sort of scientific rigor within the last 5 to 10 years. And what we now know is that there is, in fact, more pigmentation diversity within Africa than in the rest of the world put together. And yet we refer to all people of African descent as being black. It is a descriptor that we sort of know what it means. It means people of recent African descent, but it's just almost nonsensical thing to say. You know, especially in reference to when we talk about black people in the Americas, who have a different evolutionary trajectory as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and the descendants of the enslaved, which are genomically identifiably different from the people from whom they were taken. We also know by looking at the genes that encode pigmentation that there is more diversity in pigmentation genes than in the rest of the world put together. Now, you only have to go to Africa to recognize that that is absolutely the case. Pigmentation is enormously variable in Africa, all over the country. people are not the same skin tone. For a long time, the most serious consideration for the reason for for differences in pigmentation was as an adaptation as you move further away from the hot sun of the equator. Now, that is definitely part of the selection for pigmentation genes that we see around the world today, but it is certainly not the whole story whatsoever. And that is so obviously true because people at the same latitudes do not have the same pigmentation within Africa and around the rest of the world. And yet we still cling to these very old racialized epithets, which start with people like Linnaeus in those descriptions with red and yellow and black and white. And we even know by looking at the genes involved in pigmentation that variation in pigmentation predates Homo sapiens by something like 600 to 900,000 years. So remember that we're 300,000 year olds as a species, so say 500,000, just to round it up by 200,000 years. But we know that in our ancestors, which are older than that we see both genes that are associated with both light and dark pigmentation all over Africa, because we haven't really left Africa by that point. Now, I've gone on for an hour now. There is obviously tons more to talk about, but I think it's time for us to get a drink. Just to wrap up the talk section of this before we go to the questions, the reason I think it's important to talk about this is twofold. One is that, well, racism is not wrong because it is based on specious science or misunderstanding of science or lack of knowledge about the history of science. Racism is wrong because it is an affront to human dignity. The point about knowing the science, which is intrinsically linked to the racialization that is both contemporary and ephemeral, so it's only a few hundred years old, and therefore can change in the future. Our racial epithets are not fixed in time because we are not fixed in time. But understanding that is so important so that people cannot use science or misunderstanding of science or an ignorance of history to justify stereotypes or racialized stereotypes about the people of the earth. My purpose is, I'm a scientist, I'm a geneticist. My purpose is to take away those tools from people who are going to abuse science with that very purpose, because science is no ally to racists, even though science was based on racialized classification in a time of racism by racists. So that's my motivation, and I like to end with this because I think in science sometimes we are not necessarily predisposed to talk about the politics that is implicit in our work, because science we like to think of as being amoral or apolitical. It is not. It is inseparable from politics. It is inseparable from morality, because science is done by people and it is about people. And so for that reason, I think that if you are someone who's interested in human genetics, or if you are a geneticist or a biologist, and someone who refers to or uses the pool from which human variation is drawn, that is our DNA, our genomes, then this quote from Angela Davis wraps up what I think is how we should be thinking about science and race in the 21st century. And with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. Don't feel bad. You might have been slightly upstaged by Jesse as well. A lot of love in the chat and the questions. But fine. It does remind me though, if anybody hasn't yet followed @racismdog on Twitter, please go ahead and do that. He barks at racists, and there's a lot of barking going on. So we're going to take a break now, folks. I know all the pluggables and stuff have been fired into text chat, so I'll not take any more time. Just want to say big thanks, lots of applause in the text chat there for Adam. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 8:15 for your questions. Remember, you can still upvote your favourite questions in the meantime, and we'll be back very shortly to tackle those. See you soon. Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope you've grabbed yourself a drink. Tell us what you're drinking in text chat, why not? And welcome back, Adam, and welcome back, Jesse, as well. It is very telling that the top question in Slido was, shows your dog. Oh, it looks like it's just been usurped, actually. Okay, but yeah, lots of love for Jesse indeed. Okay, let's get stuck into the Q&A. So, First one we've got here, Adam, is from Paul. In your experience, does explaining the actual science of race have any effect in arguing with racists?
Well, wait a minute. Like, you know, let's just deal with question one first. I mean, absolutely perfect doggo now, but could have done with that half an hour ago, Mister. Sorry, what was the question? Does arguing with racists have any effect? Well, you know, this is a question I do get asked quite a lot in various forms with various degrees of antagonism associated with it, because I recognize that the title is deliberately pugnacious and provocative. And you know, right when people, actual racists off the debate me guys go, debate me. I'm not really into performative debates in that sense, because it's all in the book. I wrote the book. I've spent 25 years writing the book. I'm not going to stand up on stage and read bits of the book out just for entertainment value. Everything I know about this subject is in the book or referenced in the book. So that's one aspect to answer that question, which I don't know. If people think that's cowardly or weaselly, then so be it. That's the way it is. You remember the old phrase that we used to use about, you know, back when creationism was an issue. Has that gone away now? I think it has.
Yeah, we fixed it.
It's gone. We fixed that. Yeah, well done us. But, you know, Dawkins used to say, when invited to debate with creationists, that it looks better on your CV than on mine. And another version of that is, you know, never wrestle with a pig because the pig gets dirty, because you get dirty and the pig likes it. And then the third version, I was teaching my daughter these the other day because she's been involved in some racial abuse on Instagram, and I was just saying, like, just leave it well alone, fill your life with joy, and don't go with these guys, because the best possible outcome when you're arguing with an idiot is that you win an argument with an idiot. So that, you know, in a slightly more serious way, there is that phrase, that Jonathan Swift phrase, which is that, well, the contemporary version of it is that you can't reason someone out of a position, reason themselves into. And that's to a certain degree why I think the white supremacists are less interesting to engage with or to even talk about than the people I'm more concerned with, who are not racists, who don't consider themselves to be racist and don't go around shouting racial abuse, but maintain racialized stereotypes or attitudes, which are part of what I think is much more important issue of racism, which is structural racism, which is the racism of the everyday that is inbuilt, baked into our society. And that's also why I know there's a lot of questions on the Slido about sport, and that's why I think sport is important. And yes, hilarious working plants. Yes, I am an Ipswich Town fan, and there's nothing you can say can make that worse. But which is that, you know, you get, so there's this concept called positive attribute racism, where you say, well, you know, black people are better at sprinting, or black people are better at long distance running if they're East African, or Jews are better with money, or brighter, or East Asians are better with mathematics. Now, there's two things that I want to do in the book, and two things that I do in the book, which is, the first is to address how correct these stereotypes are, which I won't go into now because they're complex, but almost none of them hold up under scrutiny, but because of sample sizes and because of, you know, sport, although is enormously popular, the sport that we watch is elite athletes who are terribly misrepresentative of the populations from which they came. So the first thing is that they're not necessarily correct. And the second thing is that even though they're positive attributes, everyone wants to be faster or smarter or whatever it is, they serve to reinforce stereotypes that are rooted in those Enlightenment ideas that sub-Saharan African people, black people are physically adept, but not intellectually. And that goes straight back to what Linnaeus was saying about the inventiveness of white people. There's huge sexualization of black bodies, which I talk about a little bit in the book, and just these notions. So again, sport. There's one of the papers that I reference in the book, and I think I'm answering multiple questions here. But there's one of the papers I referenced in the book is an analysis of sports commentaries that refer to elite athletes who are either black or of European descent, of recent African or of European descent. And in the vast majority of cases where elite athletes are from African American descent, the commentators talk about their physicality, their speed, their strength, their physical prowess. And the exact equivalent proportion, the vast majority of references to white elite athletes, they talk about their inventiveness, their hard work, and their thinking, their intellectual abilities. These things are absolutely baked into our culture. And for the sports fans out there, we don't even notice this until it's pointed out. So next time you're watching some sport and listening to the commentary, just listen for when the references to black athletes are different from references to white athletes. Last week, so I believe that cricket is the high point of human evolution. You'll lose some fans there. And last week at the test against the West Indies, Jofra Archer was bowling not particularly well. And the commentator said, he's probably a bit cold out there, right? Now, I mean, what do you mean by that? This was a day after there was those amazing speeches by Nasser Hussain and Mike Holding, who some of you will have seen, about structural racism in sport itself. Mike Holding's, I urge you to seek that clip out, because it's an incredibly powerful speech, not just about sport, not just about cricket, but about structural racism. And the day after that, a commentator makes this clumsy, racially stereotyped, structurally racist comment about our second best bowler. So it's right there. It's right there throughout society. So, the people who think and say things like that are the people that I'm interested in. A lot of younger people in particular, when I was writing this book, were saying to me, I need this book at Christmas, or I need this book at Thanksgiving in the States, because these are the conversations that come up around the Christmas, the dinner table or in the pub, and I don't feel equipped to deal with them, even though intuitively I think they might be wrong. One of the guiding principles of the book is, here are your tools.
Okay. Yeah, you lost me a little bit of cricket, but I'm back, don't worry. So, I mean, it's interesting, as a Scottish football fan, I'm used to talking about sports commentators talking pish non-stop. It's somewhat disappointing to hear that they're inadvertently talking racist pish as well at the same time. But, I guess it's not that much of a surprise. Let's move on. Adam, next question from JC. Are there reliable ways to expose my own racist unconscious biases?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the best answer to this is, well, it's going to sound very self-serving, but I will widen it out. It is read books by people who aren't white. Read books about racism. There's a whole slew of them at the moment, many of which are absolutely brilliant, and they talk about the experiences of structural racism. Akala's is stunning and superb. Renier de Lodge is a mega bestseller. Praise be. Mine is very focused on the science. It has a very science angle to it, but it's much less about the personal experience of racism, much more about the underlying structural bases in science of racism and the racism that is inherent to science as well. I think the answer is you listen to people, you talk to people who have different experiences from you. I had an interesting experience early on in talking about this book. It came out in February, which is I talked about some of the same things at the beginning of a lecture in Bristol, as was, and in which the audience of several hundred was predominantly white. When I was talking about the milk chugging in the white supremacists in the States, they were laughing, right? They were laughing because it's funny, because they're ridiculous people and they deserve mockery and contempt. And afterwards, a black woman came up to me, and she wasn't aggressive. She wasn't angry about this. It's a really, really useful point, which was, she said, appreciated your talk. When you were talking about those guys, and everyone was laughing. I was horrified, right? I was thinking, what am I doing in this room? Because it is a demonstration of your privilege, not mine specifically. It is the demonstration of privilege that you can laugh at these people because it is not your family or your ancestors who were affected by their hatred and their policy and the policies of the people that they support. And I was bowled over by that because I hadn't about it. I hadn't thought about it in exactly the same way that your question was asking. How do you check your own privileges? It hadn't occurred to me, but it's not my experience, and so it's easy to just point at people and laugh because they're dickheads. But it's not so easy if your experience of their bigotry and their hatred is different from your own. So I think the answer to the question is you listen to other people.
For sure. Just following on that slightly though, Adam, if you're talking about, should we say, ridiculing the ridiculous, I think there's a lot of people who will say that has its place. Sometimes that ridicule may prompt them to self-examine and such like. So, are there cases where ridicule is the right thing versus outrage?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I mean, has anyone ever been persuaded by ridicule? I think in some ways I feel like I've changed my view on this because I think that ridicule might be a young man's game, and as I get older and tireder, and having kids, and I don't know. I mean, there is definitely a place for ridicule. It's a problem for me because I like it, and I think I'm quite good at it. And, and I get into trouble all the time on Twitter for not being able to walk away from a fight. I'm currently engaged in a hilarious spat with Toby Young, not for the first time, who has decided, because he's the king of all scientists, that I am not a scientist, which came as something of a surprise to both me and my head of department, and my colleagues and co-workers at UCL. Anyway, the problem with as you say, the problem with the ridiculous is they make it very easy. And sometimes I genuinely think that ridiculing people only serves to reinforce yourself and your pals, your team, against the other, when actually in many of these cases what we need is to reach over those bridges and say, go on, tell me what you've got to say, and let's talk about it. You can't do that on Twitter. There's no nuance on Twitter. You can't do it with Toby Young because he's a wally.
A good choice of words, very diplomatic. Okay, let's move on since I hijacked a question there. Let's see.
Where was my pint? I was due to be brought. Every time I've done this before, I've been brought a pint at this point.
Can't you send Jesse off to the fridge or something? Have you not trained him up that way yet?
Paul is asleep. Look at that.
Oh, okay. How do you argue with colleagues in science and academia who bloody well know most of this and are usually convinced by facts but are still racist? Well, that comes at a good time. Good question.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I think that so that I make that point at the end about science not being apolitical, much as though we would love it to be, and not being amoral, much as though it should be in principle. I think knowing our history is absolutely crucial in this regard because, we think, well, data. How can data be structurally racist? It's only in the implementation or the outcome, the choices we make about what we do with that data that can be racist, and therefore, and therefore science isn't structurally racist. Lawrence Krauss has been banging on about this for the last few days in the popular press, and I fundamentally disagree with that. It may be more true in high-end cosmology, but it certainly isn't true in evolution and genetics, not least because our fields are built upon the works of racists, and that those principles echo into the present. But sort of simple, trivial things that are, in fact, heavily racialized and fundamentally affect the nature of our scientific discourse, such as the fact that we haven't really sampled the genomes of African people. So all of our sweeping statements about in this amazing era of genomics are almost entirely drawn from European samples. So we know about European genetics and very little about African genetics, which is ironic given that Africa has more genetic diversity than the rest of the world put together. And we're fixing that, and we're very aware of that in genetics. And that is a sort of historical artifact, because most of this work has been done in Europe or in America. So being aware of that is one issue. We sometimes use terminology. We don't really have the right nomenclature in human genetics to describe the complexities of genealogy and population history, and you know, the use of words like race is, well, they're mostly gone now from academia, but we still see papers that talk about Caucasian populations, which is almost a meaningless scientific designation. And we see them in you know, serious academic journals. I think a lot of people are just unaware that this is even an issue. There's two things worth considering as well. The first is, does this have scientific utility? Now that is appealing to the pure scientists, to, you know, the people who just want to get on and do their work and are not concerned. I don't want to think about the political fallout of this. Then, you know, one attack is to say, does Caucasian mean anything? Is that the term you want to use? Because does it correlate with the group of people that you're talking about? Does it have any, you know, inherent or essential characteristics to it which are relevant to the data itself? In that example, the answer is no. And then the second question is the broader impact of it. You know, by using the word Caucasian, what do you mean by that? Are you aware that that is a not only has limited scientific utility, but also has historical associations that are also not scientifically useful, but are heavily racialized. So I think it's important that we scientists are better at history, better at knowing our own history, and better at understanding the roots of our field. That phrase that, you know, we stand on the shoulders of giants, but we also need to recognize that we stand on the shoulders of some real pricks as well.
Sure. Okay, and I think I missed a couple of questions, so I'm jumping back up now. This is an anonymous one, and we kind of talked about this during the break. Maybe we can expand it out just a little bit. What the question is, what are your views on the open letter about cancel culture to the NY Times recently? Now, I know maybe you haven't got direct knowledge of that, Adam, but maybe you can just talk about your thoughts on cancel culture in general.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't reckon people will believe me when I say this, but I literally haven't read that letter. I'm aware of its existence. I am sort of somewhat oblivious to its contents, and I can't remember what they're saying in it. So I shouldn't comment on that specifically. I am unconvinced that cancel culture, as described, is a real phenomenon, but I'm you know, thinking about that currently. I feel somewhat aware and slightly allergic to the idea that many of the people, certainly in the sort of race science world, who are most vocal about being cancelled are ones whose careers depend on it. So people who are not known for any other reason than having been cancelled, you know, the sort of scientific equivalence of Lawrence Fox. There's an interesting phenomenon as well within this, which is that if it is lucrative, if one does become successful, having been defenestrated for right or for wrong, that you lose the imperative, the incentive to evaluate your scenario in a dispassionate way. You know, I think about someone like Charles Murray, who I think is mostly boring. And has very little interesting things to say about science in his most revered work, The Bell Curve, and his most recent work, which I just think is uninteresting and wrong in interesting ways. I read the other day that he gets 50 to 100 grand per lecture, maybe, you know, whatever the number is. It is a phenomenal amount of money to be paid to talk about those issues, even if it's 10 grand or 20 grand. You know, still that is a lot of money. And in that, I see that, you know, you've got to be incredibly bold to really, really scrutinize your own work and positions and data which goes against the things you're saying, if your entire, not just livelihood, but immense wealth is dependent on that, I think you see people like that just get polarized into directions which are away from scientific neutrality or dispassionate evaluation of the data, because they have no incentive to do so when they are being incentivized to reinforce those views or even bolster them. I think that, in a sympathetic way, I think that's what you see with a lot of these people. I think you see that with people like Jordan Peterson as well, that once you start down this pathway and find an audience, especially an audience that are willing to pay for it, then you've got no reason to go back and say, hold on a minute, was I right about that thing that I said? Or is this data sufficient to support the argument that I'm making? And we're all guilty of that to a certain extent. I have a successful career based on talking about these things. And I say in the book that I have come to these conclusions about the biological non-reality of race by looking at the evidence, right? Because that's what we should do as scientists and as skeptics. But I'm also a human being, and I'm also a mixed race human being, and I'm someone who's experienced racism, and I believe that racism is fundamentally an affront to human dignity. And you've got to be some cold-hearted robot not to factor those things into trying to understand the nature of reality. I hope that I'm doing this right, but I guess everyone does.
For sure. I think there's a lot of those cancelled people out there drying their tears with £100 notes as well, for sure. Let's move on. Another anonymous question. And by the way, it's not somebody trying to hide their identity. It's just somebody who hasn't been bothered to create an ID on the Slido system. So the question is, why is the racism mostly from white people to minorities? Are there any other examples, such as marginalized communities of white people in African countries?
Yeah, well, I did talk about that a little bit in the book, and yes, there certainly is. I mean, this was maybe the person asking the question missed the sort of housekeeping I said at the beginning, which was that I do focus predominantly in the book on racialization from its roots in the Enlightenment and European expansionism, primarily because that is the dominant form of racism in Western culture and by extension global culture, but also because it is my experience, but my culture because I am British. But that is not to say that there aren't other versions of racism everywhere and racialized bigotry everywhere. I talk a little bit about it with regards to Africa in the book, and indeed, the Rwandan conflict is an example of that. I don't really talk about India very much, which is a very racially stratified country and also socially stratified country as well. But it's very present. So the precise wording of that question is, it has identified something that I don't do particularly well. I'm aware that I don't do it particularly well. I have some reasons why I don't do it particularly well, but not comprehensive. So it's a great question to ask, and I can't give a fully satisfactory answer.
Presumably, though, if you're looking at it on a global level, you would maybe direct your attention most to where most trouble is coming from, and it appears to be from the whites, the white people, discriminating against minorities. It's the one thing that we're best at, I guess. Okay, next question. How do you prepare yourself mentally when you check out all of those racist websites? I feel like that's the kind of thing that may cause PTSD after a while.
Yeah. Well, that's they are the worst places that I've come across. I'm a pretty mentally robust person, which is not to say that I don't find them deeply painful, tragic in many ways. These are lost souls, and we have. I think many of them are young and lost. But in many ways, they are people who have been abandoned by society and have found niches. I'm a bleeding heart liberal about these things. I think that we're not born with these prejudices in place, these specific prejudices in place. these are taught to us. These are taught to us by bad parenting, by society. And so, in some ways, in my most ridiculously liberal sensibilities, this is on all of us. So I think, I think to a certain extent, they deserve our pity. And, well, I would never advocate violence against anyone. But it's sometimes that is a tough line to think about when you're in these spaces. I get this a lot, and it's sort of ducks back to me because they're crazy people, and they make for amusing fodder for online talks to skeptics. I got a whole folder full of insults that I get sent on a daily basis. But sometimes, again, this is an example of expressing one's privilege in this kind of situation. A couple of years ago, I got sent a tweet which said, it described me as a Jewish rat and a race traitor, and I thought, well, it's odd because I'm not Jewish, but it's not, that doesn't make it any better. And Jewish rat being very specific language of the Third Reich and the Nazis. Race traitor, I don't know why that is. I mean, I'm mixed race. I'm married to a white English woman, and so I guess that's where it came from. And then the next picture was a picture. The picture that was attached to that tweet was an oven, right? Which is so deeply, calculatedly offensive. But then it was one of you guys. I think it was one of the Skeptics organizations just responded by saying they posted a picture of an electric oven. These fucking morons can't even get racism right.
Maybe just modern racism, yeah. But I guess it seems to me, Adam, that you try your best to approach some of that horrible attitude with a little bit of, should we say, maybe dark humor, and that's can act as a shield to a certain degree until such point as you think about the implications of it, right?
Yeah, and my tone in explaining science is. See, Jesse is getting up now because he spotted the cat. No, he isn't. My tone in explaining science is with a degree of levity. That's my natural disposition. These are serious issues, which doesn't mean they are without shafts of levity. But Jesse, here, come here, Jesse. All right. I couldn't give a talk with I wouldn't. I would have gone upstairs to give this talk if it weren't to you guys, if it was a less pub-based discussion. I forgot what the question was, actually.
I was just asking about your use of humor to try and give you a little bit of a mental barrier from some of the horrors that you have to research.
My last book, which was called The Book of Humans, was about human exceptionalism and whether we are special as an organism. And in writing that, I was detailing the behaviour of many different animals, which may appear to be familiar to us because it resembles human behaviour. But part of the argument of the book is it may be evolutionary related, or it may not be, and it's possibly a category error to assume that it is. In writing that book, I was constantly both flabbergasted and enormously depressed at the end of the day by the behaviour of animals, because we like to think of the beauty of nature and the elegance of nature, and there's that pretty clunky phrase, red in tooth and claw, but it's usefully descriptive. But I frequently I would, having written there's a chapter on necrophilia and coercive sex in that book, and I have a distinct memory of getting to the end of reading 30 academic papers on the behaviour of sea otters or penguins, who both of whom are dolphins, absolute assholes, and closing the computer, just going, that was depressing. This is worse. This is definitely worse. When we scratch the surface of things we know were bad, transatlantic slavery, obviously that was a bad thing.
we just sort of know that it's bad in a I knew that it was bad in a superficial way, and as soon as you scratch beneath the surface and you realize quite how bad it is, that is profoundly it's hard work and it's emotional reading, that's why we have to talk about these things, right? It's they need to be addressed. We need to know these things.
It is going to make me feel a little bit less guilty the next time I buy tuna fish that's not dolphin friendly though. So swings and roundabouts. Okay, next question from John Bray. Doesn't genetic race exist regarding incidence of certain diseases and or sensitivity to certain drugs? Ignoring this risks discrimination with respect to drug research.
It's a great question, and it's a question I do address in the book because it's a very important question. And the answer is sort of no. And what I mean by that is that people are different, populations are different, people with different ancestries have different genetic makeups, and it is not right to not acknowledge those things. Many of our differences that we see, the visual differences between people, and to an extent behavioral, but physical differences we see are as a result of local adaptation in our march around the world from Africa within the last 100,000 years. These are biological facts. This is the reality of humankind. People are different to each other, and we see those differences. The key issue is, do they correlate? Do those differences correlate or map onto the racialized categories that we use socially today? And the answer to that is no, they do not. Now, when it comes to disease, there are most definitely regional differences between people in terms of their susceptibility to various diseases. That is unequivocally correct. Do they map to specific races? In not one single case is that correct. Does that occur? The best or the most frequently cited example is sickle cell disease or sickle cell anemia, which is characterized as a black disease and has been historically for the last century or so since it was first described. And to the extent, and I say this in the book, to the extent that it's referenced in a Tupac song and other hip hop tracks. Is it a black disease? No, it is not. It is a disease associated with malaria. So it exists at high frequency in areas of the world where malaria has been endemic during ancestral history, which means that there are a significant proportion of Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, and as a result of transatlantic enslavement, African Americans who have a higher frequency of sickle cell. Is it exclusive to African Americans or Africans? The answer is very much no. Does it also exist in populations? No, that's not a question. It also exists at high frequency in populations from Greece, from the Middle East, from India, from South America. Basically, wherever malaria is endemic, you find sickle cell. Now, that's one example. That's the most frequently cited example. Tay-Sachs was the first racialized disease that was discovered in 1880 and 1884, I think it was from memory, by two doctors in London and New York, Dr. Tay and Dr. Warren Sachs. And both times it was discovered in Ashkenazi Jewish families, which at that time had a high degree of consanguinity, and recessive genetic disorders are often commonly expressed or commonly occur in families with a high degree of inbreeding or consanguinity. Immediately, and bear in mind it's the late 18th century, this is the trajectory of anti-Semitism that will culminate in the Holocaust, they get labeled as the Jewish disease, to the extent that the same was described in a non-Jewish family in London and was given a different name, right? Now, does it exist at a high frequency in Jewish of so knowledge and discussion about who one should have children with? Tay-Sachs has almost been eradicating Ashkenazi Jewish populations today, but it is not exclusive to Jews. There are no diseases that I'm aware of that correlate or overlap or match to any significant degree racialized categories that we use today. And the reason for that is because the racialized categories we use today are social and not biological.
For sure. Great answer, thank you. Okay, let's move on. The next question is from N. So that's presumably nitrogen. Do you have any recommendations on how to implement non-racist systems within organisations, or how to dismantle systemic racism?
Wow, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, the answer is the same as the one before about personal biases, which is to educate oneself. It is incumbent on personal responsibility to address our own biases that we may not even be aware of, but that also extends to institutional structural biases, not just about race, but also about sexism and ableism and many other societal issues. There is, of course, the question it relates to the issue of positive discrimination, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing if implemented correctly, because is it not the case with positive discrimination or affirmative action that if there is a committee somewhere that is deciding that someone should be employed over someone else, partly because of their heritage, partly because of their heritage or their ancestry, then that has no bearing on the recruitment itself, on the person being recruited. It's possible that I haven't given this enough to give an eloquent answer, but I don't think necessarily it is a bad thing. We're doing this at the moment at UCL, where we're considering how the various members of the department that I'm still in the 19th and 20th century, many of whom were awful eugenicists and scientific racists, such as Galton and Pearson and Ronald Fisher, one of the greatest scientific geniuses of all time, but a staunch eugenicist, about renaming and removing their sort of celebratory statue. Well, not that there are no statues, but you know what I mean. And one of the anxieties that we talk about a lot within my department is that in doing things like renaming, there is a question about whether this is gesture politics, whether it is important enough, and whether it is a mask for what the real issue is, which is lack of representation, particularly of black kids in biology, in genetics, at UCL and beyond. So I don't know the answer to that question. It's an important question. It is an active part of the discussions that we're having at major institutions such as the university that I'm at. But yeah, so again, I don't know. Important question.
Yeah, I guess it was a bit too much of us to expect you to have the answer to that one. Since nobody else has quite managed it so far anyway.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, one of the things I keep saying in the book about and saying in talks is I'm not going to fix racism with this book. It's not. I can't move on from this and go, yeah, I've done that, I've done it. It's all good now. The purpose of it, my interest in it, is to destabilize or to remove the pseudo-scientific crutches of racists, and to equip anti-racists or non-racists to become anti-racist with the right tools to hand. Like I said at the beginning, prejudice realigns to cultural norms. Sometimes people ask me if people will always be racist in the same way, and I think, well, or will racism ever end? And the answer is I got no idea. Bigotry never seems to end, but it does shift according to cultural practices. That I take great solace. Come on. I take great solace in the historical knowledge that it hasn't always been like this. The racism that we experience today is modern. Come on. He's an idiot. You're such a handsome idiot. Yeah, you are.
It's the best kind of idiot, a handsome one. Okay, well, I tell you what, we're running short on time anyway, Adam. Let's maybe take one more question. Top of the list at the moment. Are there any ways to tell when it's worth having these conversations and you might actually change opinions, and when it's not? Or is it worthwhile regardless? I think maybe there's a thought that even if you have what may seem to be a waste of time conversation with somebody, that you might plant some seeds at the back of their brain that might grow later on. But, you know, considering you spend time arguing on Twitter, I'm not sure you're the best person to answer this, but give us your thoughts, Adam.
Down, down, down. Jesse, down, down. You're not allowed up there.
I thought you were telling me to get down there.
Get down, Brian. Sorry, so the question was when one decides to go in or not.
Yeah.
Well, you know, yeah, it's anecdotal, but I do get a lot of feedback from people saying, you know, I read the sports section and I didn't know that. You know, I that's what I thought. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is super superficial in the sense that I mean the prejudices are superficial in the sense that, you know, in sports the dominance of East Africans in long distance running is 40 years old or so. For the first half of the 20th century, it was Finnish people. Jews dominated both boxing and basketball for most of the 20th century. Swimming is one that bugs the hell out of me because there is a long-standing myth, sometimes held by black people, that due to bone density, people of recent African descent are biologically less good at swimming. Now, there's a sort of very misunderstood, slightly flaky piece of data that may underwrite that incorrect thought. There isn't a difference in bone density to do with actuary data and osteoporosis in certain African American populations. But the notion that there is this biological factor which makes the difference between being able to swim or not, or being interested in swimming or not, is nonsensical. When Swim America in 2014, I think it was, surveyed the reasons why 60% of African Americans don't or can't swim, all of the reasons were socioeconomic, right? Swimming pools after segregation in 64 were built in white areas. Swimming is extracurricular, therefore has a socioeconomic cost. There's an economic cost. Absence of role models. There have been 2 African Americans in the whole history of the Olympics swimming. Parents who don't swim is the second biggest correlate. And the third one is not being taught how to swim, right? That is how people learn how to swim. They get taught how to swim, not because they have some mystical biological sinking factor, right? All of the reasons why African Americans don't swim, or the majority of them don't swim, are social, not biological. Now, pointing that out seems like trivial and you know, not difficult to research or understand. But the fact of the matter is that the death rate from drowning in African American kids between the ages of 8 and 14 is 3 times higher than it is for white or European descended kids in America. So in this case, you know, you've got a structural racism which is literally lethal at a significantly greater rates than for white Americans. And worse than that, it's bought into by African Americans. And, you know, that just bugs the hell out of me. I've got someone at the door. Can you just hold on for a second?
You're back. Well, hopefully it wasn't anybody at the door, asking you questions about white supremacy. Adam, any pluggables before we let you go?
No. You know how to find me. It's all in the book. You know, you guys know what to do. Buy me a pint next time the pubs are open. That's what I'd like to happen when I come and do Skeptics in the various places. I gotta go because it's actually my weekly shop that's arrived. I didn't realize it had been going on. My daughter is dealing with it. I'm gonna go and help her. I'm gonna sign off now. Love you guys, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Adam. All right, loads of love in the text chat for you.